Every single thing inside your PC talks through one connection: your GPU, your SSD, your Wi-Fi card, your NVMe drive. They all speak PCIe. This standard has quietly been doubling its speed for over 20 years straight. But most people couldn't explain the difference between Gen 3 and Gen 5 if you paid them. So let's fix that. Every PCIe generation, from the one that replaced a bus from the 90s to the one that hasn't even arrived yet. PCIe 1.0. It was 2003, and the inside of a PC was a traffic jam. PCI was a shared bus where every device fought for the same lane. AGP gave graphics cards their own road, but it was already maxing out. Nvidia and ATI were pushing harder every year. The industry needed something completely new. PCI Express threw out the old parallel bus and went serial. Think of it like tearing down a crowded two-lane road and replacing it with dedicated express tunnels for every device. Each lane could push 250 megabytes per second in each direction. A full X16 slot delivered about 4 gigabytes per second. That was a massive jump over AGP. GPUs finally had room to breathe. The first PCIe motherboards weren't exactly cheap. Early adoption was slow and awkward, but Intel backed the standard hard, and PCIe came with a killer feature from day one: backward and forward compatibility. A tiny X1 card fit in a X16 slot. A Gen 1 card worked in a Gen 2 board years later. That one decision shaped everything that followed. PCIe 1.0 didn't just offer more bandwidth. It killed AGP, and PCI became the universal standard and never once looked back. PCIe 2.0. By 2007, graphics cards were getting hungrier. The GeForce 8800 was devouring everything in its path. PCIe 1.0 still had headroom for most people, but the ceiling was clearly visible. Gen 2 doubled the per-lane speed to 500 megabytes per second. 8x16 slot now pushed roughly 8 gigabytes per second. Same physical connector, same slot shape, just faster underneath. For most users, the upgrade was honestly invisible. You didn't feel Gen 2 the way you felt a new GPU. It was like widening a highway before rush hour actually hits. The real benefit was breathing room. Multi-GPU setups like SLI and Crossfire were the hot trend, and those needed bandwidth to share data between cards. Gen 2 kept the pipes open. Motherboards with PCIe 2.0 didn't cost much more than Gen 1 boards either. It was a clean, quiet bump. No drama, no compatibility headaches. Meanwhile, AMD and Nvidia were deep in their GPU war, trading blows every 6 months. PCIe 2.0 just quietly made sure neither side ran into a bandwidth wall. Not the most exciting generation, but exactly the one the ecosystem needed to keep growing without tripping over itself. PCIe 3.0. This is the generation that moved in and refused to leave. The Spec landed in 2010, and it dominated for the better part of a decade. Each lane hit roughly 1 gigabyte per second. A X16 slot delivered about 16 gigabytes per second total. But the real trick was the encoding change under the hood. Gen 3 switched from 8B/10B encoding to 128B/130B. That slashed overhead from 20% down to barely 1.5%. You got nearly double the usable bandwidth without doubling the raw signal speed. Like getting a bigger delivery truck that doesn't burn any more gas. For years, this was more than enough. GPUs through the GTX 900 and GTX 1000 series barely touched Gen 3's ceiling. NVMe SSDs launched during this era and completely changed storage. Suddenly your boot drive was reading at over 3,000 megabytes per second through a tiny M.2 slot. That felt like magic. Gen 3 boards were everywhere and affordable. Intel stuck with Gen 3 all the way through its 10th generation of core processors. AMD actually moved on first. If you've built a PC in the last decade, you've almost certainly used Gen 3 at some point. It was the Honda Civic of PCIe. Reliable, boring, absolutely everywhere, and it just refused to die. PCIe 4.0. AMD dropped this one first, and that made waves. When Zen 2 launched in mid-2019, it brought PCIe 4.0 to consumer desktops before Intel had anything close. Each lane doubled again to roughly 2 GB per second. A X16 slot hit around 32 GB per second. But the biggest change wasn't in graphics, it was storage. Gen 4 NVMe drives blasted past 5,000 megabytes per second in sequential reads. Game loading screens got noticeably shorter. Huge file transfers felt almost instant. It was like upgrading from a garden hose to a fire hose. This was the first PCIe generation where regular users could feel the difference in daily tasks. GPUs still weren't saturating a Gen 3x16 link for gaming, so the graphics benefit was minimal. But for video editors, creators, and anyone moving big files around, Gen 4 was genuinely transformative. Prices on Gen 4 drives dropped fast too. Within a couple years, they barely cost more than Gen 3 options. If you were in the comments saying Gen 4 didn't matter, your SSD respectfully disagrees. Intel eventually caught up with Rocket Lake in 2021, but AMD held the bragging rights for 2 full years. Gen 4 proved that PCIe upgrades weren't just spec sheet trivia anymore. People could actually feel the difference in their everyday workflow. PCIe 5.0. Intel actually beat AMD to this one. Alder Lake landed in late 2021 with Gen 5 support on the primary X16 slot. Each lane doubled yet again to roughly 4 GB per second. A full X16 slot now offered around 64 GB per second. On paper, absolutely absurd. In practice, almost nothing needed it. Gen 5 NVMe SSDs started appearing in 2023, pushing sequential reads past 10,000 megabytes per second. The benchmarks looked incredible. But real-world application performance? Barely different from Gen 4 for most everyday tasks. And those early drives ran hot. Like, needs a dedicated heatsink with its own fan. Hot. Some felt more like science experiments than storage upgrades. For GPUs, even the RTX 4090 didn't fully saturate a Gen 4x16 connection. Gen 5 on the graphics side was pure future-proofing. The drives cost significantly more at launch. AMD brought Gen 5 support with Zen 4 on AM5 in 2022. Since then, Gen 5 SSDs have gotten cheaper and cooler. But most people building a PC today are still perfectly fine on Gen 4. Gen 5 is the generation where the spec outran the software. The bandwidth is there. The apps just haven't caught up yet. It's an investment in tomorrow, not a necessity for today. PCIe 6.0. The spec was finalized in January 2022, and this generation rewrites the rulebook under the hood. Each lane pushes roughly 7.5 GB per second. A X16 slot delivers over 120 GB per second. But the real headline is the signaling change. Every previous generation used NRZ signaling. That's 1 bit per signal transition. Gen 6 switches to PAM4, 4 signal levels per transition, doubling data throughput without doubling the frequency. Think of it like a highway, where every car suddenly carries 2 passengers instead of 1. Same number of cars, twice the people moved. This matters because raw signal speeds were getting so high that cables and traces on the circuit board were struggling to keep up. PAM4 keeps the frequency manageable while still pushing more data. The trade-off is noise sensitivity. So Gen 6 also bakes in mandatory forward error correction. Right now, this generation is aimed squarely at data centers, AI accelerators, and high-performance networking. Don't expect a Gen 6 gaming SSD in your next build. Consumer products are still a few years out. But the engineering being developed here will trickle down eventually. Gen 6 is where PCIe stopped being just about raw speed and started being about engineering around the laws of physics. PCIe 7.0. This one is still on the drawing board, and the numbers are borderline absurd. The spec targets roughly 15 GB per second per lane. A X16 slot would push around 242 GB per second. That's more bandwidth than most people's entire RAM kit can deliver. Let that sink in for a second. Consumer hardware running Gen 7 is probably somewhere around 2028 or later. The spec is expected to continue using PAM4 signaling with further refinements. The focus is clearly on AI workloads. massive data center interconnects, and next-generation accelerators that chew through data faster than anything today can feed them. For gamers and everyday users, Gen 7 is a distant horizon. But that's fine. Every previous generation launched ahead of real demand and let the software grow into it. Like building a 10-lane highway through a quiet town. Seems ridiculous today. Makes perfect sense 5 years later. The PCIe roadmap just keeps doubling, and so far, the real world has always found a way to fill the pipe. From a messy tangle of PCI and AGP slots in 2003 to a standard pushing hundreds of gigabytes per second, PCIe has quietly been the backbone of every major PC upgrade you've ever done. Gen 3 stuck around forever. Gen 4 made SSDs feel like magic. Gen 5 is still waiting for its moment. Gen 6 is rewriting the physics. And Gen 7 already sounds like science fiction. 20 years of doubling, and they're still not done. What PCIe generation are you actually running in your system right now? Drop it in the comments. If this cleared things up, a like genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. Next video, we're covering every USB standard explained. Because if you thought PCIe naming was confusing, USB is about to make your head spin. Click the video on screen right now.